It's time for us to check back in with the homecoming and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Olivia was feeding wood to the old cooking range. She watched the first red blaze appear, heard the sharp crackle and then a spit of sparks. The wood was dry. It would make a hot flame for roasting the turkey. She had objected mildly when Homer and Ida had left, but now that they were gone, it was good to be alone in the house, free of her mother's suggestions that Clay was off playing poker or drinking whiskey or spending the week's paycheck in sinful ways. She poked the stove wood, and when she was satisfied that the fire was going well, she closed out the bright eye of the fire with a stove lid. She felt better now that she had a plan. It was a village custom that if the man of the house did not return home at some reasonable hour, the oldest child in the family would go looking for him. Olivia had taken some pride that she had never had to send Clayboy to look for Clay, but tonight she would sacrifice pride. When the children arrived home, she installed the younger ones at the radio in the living room and quietly called Clayboy into the kitchen. "What's the matter, Mama?" asked Clayboy, his hands outstretched over the cooking range to catch its warmth. "I didn't want to say it in front of anybody, but I'm worried about your daddy. I expect his bus is late. It's a right snowy night. Could be any one of 1,000 things. Bus could have slid off the road. Maybe he's already at Hickory Creek and the snow's too thick for him to walk the 6 miles home. It's a blizzard outside." "I could go look for him, I reckon," said Clayboy. Having thought of it, the boy warmed to the idea. It was better than sitting home waiting. "I thought maybe if you could find Charlie Sneed, he's got that old truck, you tell him I said to ride you over to Hickory Creek and see if there's any sign of Clay walking. Charlie's down at the pool hall, or was. I saw his truck down there a while ago. Then you try to catch him. Tell Charlie we'll pay for the gas." "I'll tell him. Don't say anything to the children. I don't want them to worry." Clayboy slipped into his father's old sheepskin jacket and buttoned it across his chest. The jacket was big on him, and he seemed to disappear somewhere inside it, his thin, freckled face swimming inside the turned-up collar. "What you going to wear on your head?" asked Olivia. "My cap's a little wet, but it'll do," replied Clayboy. "Wait a minute," said Olivia. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a package wrapped in white tissue paper and tied with a red ribbon bow. "This was going to be your present from Santa Claus," she said. "You're getting it early." From the package, Clayboy removed a red woolen cap. Olivia had knitted it herself in the long nights alone in the living room after the children had gone to bed and before sleep caught up with her. "It's right pretty, Mama," said Clayboy gratefully and placed the cap on his head. "Pull it down over your ears. I made it plenty long so your ears wouldn't freeze." Olivia found a long warm scarf and wrapped it around his throat so that with the cap above and the scarf below, all that could be seen of Clayboy were his eyes. "And if somebody asks you what you're doing out, don't you tell them that you're looking for your daddy," admonished Olivia as he looked back in parting. "Yes, ma'am," answered Clayboy. He closed the door behind him and thrust himself into the elements. A hard wind slashed the sleet and snow, almost whipping his breath away for a moment, but the coat and cap and scarf protected him. He felt like a warm old turtle inside his shell. At the corner where the road turned, he looked back at the house, but all that was visible were vague, damp patches of light which shone from the windows. He plunged down the road into the darkness, making his way more from memory than any landmark he could find with his eyes. Charlie Sneed's truck was still parked in front of the pool hall when Clayboy staggered up through the blizzard. Underneath the single street light, he noticed that Charlie had grown careless, for the tarpaulin which covered the back of the pickup truck had been left loose, and underneath, clearly visible, was the antlered head of the poached deer. Clayboy pulled the tarpaulin back in place, climbed the steps to the pool hall, and entered. The room he had come into was called the restaurant. It occupied one long quarter of the rectangular building, the remainder of the building being given over to the pool hall. A counter lit by a row of bare electric overhead lights ran the length of the restaurant. Tables with soapstone tops surrounded by chairs of a variety of styles filled the remainder of the room. From the adjoining room came the solid click of pool balls hitting against each other. Clayboy was uncertain of his reception here. There was an unwritten law that no children and no decent woman ever entered the building. It was strictly a man's preserve and a jealously guarded one. "Hey," said a voice which came from Ike Godsey. Ike appeared from behind the counter where he was lethargically washing glasses in a steaming tub of soapy water. Ike, the bald, round-faced owner, bartender, chef, and bouncer combined, looked at Clayboy with surprise and displeasure. "You know I can't serve you, Clayboy," complained Ike. "Don't you know better than that?" "I know that, Mr. Godsey," answered Clayboy, shaking the snow from his shoulders in showers. "I'm looking for Charlie Sneed." Ike peered into the adjoining room, his face clouded with disgust. He beckoned to Clayboy. Puzzled, Clayboy crossed to Ike and leaned across the counter between the jar of pickled pig's feet and the beef jerky to where Ike was beckoning him closer with a wave of his hand. "Is your daddy home from Waynesboro yet?" "No, sir," answered Clayboy, "but we're looking for him any time. I wish he'd get here. Maybe he'd talk sense into Ep Bridges." "What's Ep done now?" "Arrested Charlie Sneed for hunting out of season. Got him handcuffed in yonder. Claims he's going to throw him in the jail up in Lovingston." As sympathetic as he was to Charlie's misfortune, Clayboy regretted it for personal reasons. He knew of no one else he could ask for a ride to Hickory Creek, and there was no way now that he could be of help to his father if Clay indeed happened to be walking home from the bus stop. "My daddy been here tonight?" asked Clayboy. "Nobody breezed in here but that trash that calls himself the law." "I reckon I better get home," said Clayboy. "That's where I'm heading as soon as the law finishes his pool game," said Ike. "Night, Mr. Godsey," said Clayboy, and started back toward the door past the entrance to the pool room. He had not intended to peer in, but when he did, he stopped full in his tracks at the sight of Charlie, sitting forlornly on the bench he was handcuffed to. "Lord, Charlie," exclaimed Clayboy sympathetically. "You ever see such a messed up situation?" inquired Charlie bitterly. "How'd it happen?" asked Clayboy. "I run over a calf up yonder on the road a piece. Throwed him in the back of the truck instead of letting him lay there and go to waste. First calf I ever seen had 10-point antlers," laughed Ep Bridges from the pool table where he powdered his cue stick with blue chalk. Ep Bridges was 200 pounds of malice, a beefy red-faced man with a spare tire of flesh girdling his middle, which also supported a Colt 45 on a webbed holster. "That's one of Clyde Robbins' calves," insisted Charlie innocently. "I was going to stop by Clyde's and pay him for the damage first thing in the morning." "First thing in the morning you was going to fry venison," said Ep. "That's what you was going to do." "What's going to become of that calf, Ep?" asked Charlie righteously. "I'm going to grind him up and make venison sausage once the judge has seen the evidence," said Ep. He leaned against the pool table, supported the cue stick in his crooked index finger, and ran the 5, 6, 7, and 8 balls into pockets in quick succession. "That's where you are, Charlie Sneed," chuckled Ep. "Behind the 8 ball." "Ep, be a Christian and let me off," pleaded Charlie. "Christmas ain't no time to throw a man in that Lovingston jail. It's cold and drafty. I'm liable to catch pneumonia and die before morning. You want it on your conscience that I died of pneumonia on Christmas Day?" "You should have thought about that when you dropped that buck," said Ep, draining the can of the last drop of Coors. "I run over that calf by accident," Charlie persisted. "He just jumped in front of the truck. I couldn't stop, came near to skidding off the road as it was." "Come on, Charlie, let's go to Lovingston," said Ep. He tossed his empty beer can into a trash barrel, crossed to the bench where he had handcuffed his prisoner, and unlocked the side which held Charlie to the bench. "Wait a minute, Ep," said Charlie, and turned to Clayboy. "You run home and tell your daddy about the fix I'm in." "Daddy ain't home yet," said Clayboy. "We still setting up for him." "What boy is this, Charlie?" asked the sheriff. "He's Clay Spencer's boy," said Charlie. "Last time I laid eyes on Clay Spencer was when I raided that old black church. They had a poker game going on out there." "That's probably where he is right this minute," said Charlie wistfully. "One thing's sure, you ain't going to be joining up with him," said the sheriff, and began leading Charlie toward the door. "Mr. Bridges," called Clayboy. The sheriff turned and looked back at the boy curiously. Clayboy hesitated. He hated to ask a favor of a man who was taking Charlie Sneed to jail, but he was desperate. "You'll be going by the black church on your way to Lovingston, won't you?" "Sure," replied App. "You wouldn't give me a ride, would you?" asked Clayboy. "You figuring to get mixed up with a poker game?" asked App wonderingly. "No, sir," answered Clayboy. "I just want to see if my daddy happens to be there." "I ain't supposed to carry riders," said App, considering. "But what the heck, it's Christmas, come on." Clayboy followed his father's friend and the sheriff to the sheriff's white Dodge with the words "County Sheriff" painted on the doors in forbidden black lettering. Once Charlie was placed in the caged-off back seat, Clayboy climbed into the front seat, positioning his feet between the 2 six-packs of beer which were stored there. "I could sure use one of them beers," said Charlie piteously from the back seat. Ed Bridges pretended not to notice Charlie's thirst as he entered the driver's seat and started the car. The blizzard had abated somewhat, but the snow still fell heavily, making it difficult for Ed Bridges to find the road, and when he found it, to stick to it. There had been no cars in or out of the village, so there was no tracks for him to follow. Coming to some place where there was a question, he would get out of the car, shine his powerful torchlight around until he was sure of the direction he should take, and then take it. "I feel like a zoo monkey," grumbled Charlie Sneed in the caged-off back seat. "How about passing one of them beers back here to wet a man's throat?" Sometimes Ed Bridges would answer, but more often he would ignore Charlie, his attention focused on the difficult driving, intent on delivering his prisoner to the county seat and going on to the old Seminole Trail Inn on Highway 29 for a wide slice of coconut custard pie and to swap jokes with Haley Stringfellow, the night girl. It had crossed his mind to stop at the First Abyssiana Baptist Church and put the fear of God into any poker players who might be there, but the thought of Haley Stringfellow urged him on, and when he came to the turnoff to the First Abyssiana Baptist Church, he paused briefly to let the boy out of the car. "Why don't you give the boy a ride all the way, App?" called Charlie from the back seat. "That road ain't fitting to drive on, even in dry weather," said App. "I'd be mired up to my axle before I went 100 feet. "I can make it, Mr. Bridges," said Clayboy. "I'm much obliged for the lift." "You tell your daddy to come go my bell," called Charlie, just before Ed Bridges reached over, slammed the door shut, and moved off down the road. Watching the glow of Ed Bridges' headlights swiftly disappear into the soft snow, Clayboy wished he had brought a flashlight. The First Abyssiana Baptist Church was a quarter of a mile down an unpaved road. The snow was already nearly a foot deep, and he had no light to guide him. Blindly, Clayboy started down the road, sometimes losing his way, knowing he had drifted too far to the right or to the left when he came to a ditch or to snow-shrouded bushes. Once he thought he was lost, for he went a long way with nothing to bar his passage. He thought he might have wandered into an open meadow, but his hand touched something, and when he felt it, he recognized barbed wire. Clinging to the barbed wire, he continued on, hoping that it would lead him to the black church and not away from it. Somewhere above the screaming wind and the biting whine of snow, Clayboy heard singing voices. The voices came and went, then drifted back again, but Clayboy made out enough of the words to recognize it came upon a midnight clear. Dimly ahead of him he saw a light, and he let go of the barbed wire fence which he had clung to like a lifeline and plowed through the snow toward the square of light. The voices grew stronger, and by the time he came to the graveyard behind the church, Clayboy knew that no white men were playing a clandestine game of poker in the church tonight. The rightful tenants had occupied it, and a service was in progress. Clayboy entered the vestibule, which was separated from the main church by folding doors. He had intended to rest there for a moment and warm himself, but as he opened the outer door, the wind forced the folding doors open, and row after row of startled faces turned to see who had entered. Now the swinging doors folded shut again, and Clayboy debated what to do. If he went in, he would interrupt the service. If he remained where he was, the people might think he was some white man there on mischief. The singing voices had already died away. He realized that by standing there, he was already increasing the worshippers' anger or anxiety or whatever they might be feeling. So he pushed the swinging doors aside and went in. Row after row of faces looked back at him questioningly. He stood there for a moment, uncomfortable that he had interrupted the service, seeing in the eyes that gazed at him that he had no right and was not welcome. A wave of resentment flowed through the congregation, a murmur of whispered voices melding toward the anger. He wanted to speak, to tell them that he was not one of the white men who desecrated their church with their poker playing, but he could not find the words to say it. "Is that you, Clayboy?" The speaker was a man standing at the foot of the center aisle. He was a man in his 50s, a vigorous, muscular, tall man whose hair was just beginning to be touched with gray. Because the man was dressed in a black suit, white shirt, and black tie, Clayboy had not recognized Hawthorne Dooley, a farmer whose land Clayboy and his father had often gone to hunt and fish, a leader in the black community. "Hey, Hawthorne," said Clayboy, "what you doing out here?" "I was lost," said Clayboy. "Come on down here and warm yourself," said Hawthorne. "I don't want to get in the way," said Clayboy. "Come on up to the fire," said Hawthorne, and met Clayboy halfway down the aisle of wooden benches and led him to where the pot-bellied stove glowed red and hot. Clayboy was conscious of the watching eyes turning from resentment to acceptance, and he was relieved. "Scrunch over," Hawthorne called to a family on the bench nearest the fire. Obligingly, smiling now that he was a welcome guest, the family moved together to make room for Clayboy at the end of the bench. Clayboy was reassured by the smiles of two of the little boys sitting next to him. He had never been anywhere where he was the only white person present, and it made him nervous. He'd been told things about them, that they were different from white people. Wondering how they worshiped God, he guessed maybe they might sing spirituals or roll on the floor like holy rollers. Hawthorne returned to his position in front of the congregation, looked out over his flock, and announced, "We'll continue the service with hymn number 302. There was a rustling of pages as hands turned the page of hymnals, found the page, and waited. Now Hawthorne led off the first line of the hymn, and the congregation joined in. "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by." Clayboy felt something nudge his elbow, and he looked down to see that the little boy standing next to him was offering to share his hymnal. Clayboy knew the words, but he smiled back at the little boy and pretended to sing from the book, joining his voice to the richness of the old Christmas hymn. "Still in thy dark night shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." The song reached its end, and silence fell in the room. Hawthorne tiptoed to the side of the center platform and pulled a clothesline on which sheets had been hung to form a curtain. As the curtain parted, there came into view a barnyard setting. Instruments of work, a hoe, a scythe, a pitchfork hung from a wooden backdrop. In front of the backdrop, 2 sheep and a goat were lying quietly beside an old wooden cradle. 2 roosters pecked at corn and walked as far as the cord tethers allowed. When the curtain had parted, Hawthorne picked up his Bible and began to read. "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and all went to be taxed, each one into his own city." 2 figures appeared from behind the backdrop and made their way down the platform to the sheep and goats and chickens. Clayboy recognized the little Joseph as Hawthorne's grandson, Claudy. He wore a flowing purple velvet cape, and a turban of the same material was wound about his head. Following Claudy was little Emmerine Hoover, the daughter of Estelle Hoover, who taught the one-room black school. As Mary, mother of Jesus, she was clad in a white tunic, and on her head was a glowing silver halo. The children reached the wooden cradle, stole a furtive look out toward the congregation, then knelt in practiced unison. And so it was, read Hawthorne, that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. Mary reached into the cradle and picked up a doll. She held it to her breast for a moment, then offered it for Joseph's inspection. Now casually, almost conversationally, Joseph began to sing, "Hey Mary, what you gonna name that pretty little baby?" And Mary answered, "Some call him one thing, I think I'll call him Jesus." "Oh yes," cried affirming voices in the congregation. Behind the children appeared other children, dressed as shepherds and wise men, and they repeated the query, "Hey Mary, what you gonna name that pretty little baby?" And once again Mary replied, "Some call him one thing, I think I'll call him Emmanuel." "Yes, Lord," said voices in the congregation, and now the men took up the question Joseph had asked, and the women answered along with Mary, and their voices rose and the pace quickened until they could no longer sing from their seats, but had to rise and shout for glory and exultation at the coming of the Lord. Reverently, the singing voices lowered almost to a whisper. On stage, the shepherds and wise men approached the child and knelt with bowed heads. Now a powerful voice, controlled by tremulous reverence, began to sing, and when Clayboy looked, he saw that it was Hawthorne. His face lifted to heaven, his eyes closed. "O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." Shivers went down Clayboy's back. He had heard the hymn since he was a baby, carried to church in his mother's arms, but he had never heard it sung this way before. Hawthorne crooned the song, stroked and caressed it with tenderness, letting his voice cling to the melody, elongating the last line as if reluctant to let it go, until the feeling and the events the song described seemed to be taking place now and here, not 2,000 years ago in some distant biblical storybook place. A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Fall on your knees, O hear the angel voices. O night divine, O night when Christ was born, O night divine, O night divine. We'll stop right there, right in the middle of their play. What a beautiful part of the book. The writer is so good with his descriptions, makes you feel like you were just right there with Clayboy, whether it was him trudging in the snow trying to find his way to the pool hall and then finding out that Charlie had been arrested for poaching, even though he was trying to claim it was a cow. It was obviously was a big buck, and especially on his way to the church, I felt like, is he going to make it? Is he going to get lost? Is he going to wander out into the woods and not know where he's at? But then for him actually to get there and then to be part of their beautiful, beautiful Christmas program and to hear those beautiful voices raised in praise. A Little Town of Bethlehem quoted some from that song. It's hard for me to say what my favorite Christmas song is, but that's one of my very favorite ones because it's just so beautiful. A lot of the Christmas songs, growing up in church, I think of the ones that we sing in church. They're so beautiful, the lyrics are so meaningful, so powerful, like he was saying, where you just feel like your voice, you just got to sing with glory almost, just they're so powerful. It's kind of sad that we don't sing them but one time of the year, this time of the year. But such beauty in those hymns, in those Christmas hymns. I just love them. Oh, Holy Night, that was the last one that Hawthorne was singing. Beautiful, beautiful song. I've been to lots of Christmas plays where that's like a solo that somebody does, and it's just lovely. Just such beautiful, beautiful words of praise. Left us though with a cliffhanger. Now you think about it, it's so crazy the way we are today. We're in constant communication, but you think about your husband, your father, somebody like that, your brother, whoever it is, not coming home like Clay, and we'd have so many ways of contacting him. Of course, he'd probably have a cell phone in his pocket, so you could just say, hey, where are you? If not, we could call the local sheriff's department or whoever. We could, there's just so many different avenues of trying to find someone that we don't know where they're at today. We're hardly ever out of contact with each other, almost to the point that maybe it's not a good thing the way we are. But then that's the drastic part where he doesn't come home and they just don't know. There's no phone to call. There's no phone on the other end if you could call. And so there Olivia had to send Clayboy out and just say, go find your daddy. And she even says that that's kind of the tradition there, because the mother can't leave the other children, so it's just kind of the custom, if the husband, the dad, don't come home, that you send the oldest one out to look for him. So just such a drastically different time. Now, when I was growing up, I'm thinking more about parents, not husbands and wife, and Granny would want me to call her and tell her I got somewhere. I'd have to call. I'd have to use either, if I was going to somebody's house, call from their house phone, their landline. If I was in town, she would want me to call I'd use a pay phone to call and check in with her. And I was grateful when Corey and Katie were teenagers, going here and there, that they could just text me and say, I'm here. I could text them and say, when are you coming home? If Matt was here, he would say, and did they always text back? No. Right when you wanted them to, they wouldn't. But anyway, that constant communication, being able to communicate like that, is really something that we take for granted today. And then reading this story about them wondering where Clayboy's at. Did he even leave work? Is he still there? Is he going to spend the night? All those things. There's just no way of knowing. And even thinking about living like that does me, I don't know if it does anybody else, but in today's world makes you feel kind of panicky. But in those days, that was just how they lived. So if somebody didn't come home, they just assumed, well, they probably had to spend the night and they'll be home tomorrow. And that was just how they lived. It's just such a drastic difference. So I hope you enjoyed this part as much as I did, especially that beautiful church service. It just makes me wish I was there, sitting on one of the pews watching and listening to the music. And I love Christmas plays, so seeing the manger scene and all that would have just been so lovely. And then the vision of the snow too, of Clayboy having to hold on to the barbed wire fence, and even old Charlie in the back of the police cruiser there, police car, getting took off to jail, is all a very interesting part of the book. Leave a comment, let me know what jumped out at you, and got to drop back by for the next reading, which will be Friday. We've only got 2 more left, so we're almost to the end. We've got to figure out, though, what happens to Clay before it can really be Christmas for him.